Netflix's latest star-studded drama, The Trial of the Chicago 7, written and directed by Aaron Sorkin, depicts the true story of 8 activists falsely accused of inciting riots during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Now you might be wondering to yourself, if there were 8 on trial, why isn't it called The Trial of the Chicago 8? Well, I'll be covering all that and more, including the real-life characters portrayed on screen, and also looking into whether some of these events depicted in the film actually happened. Like, did Abby and Jerry actually dress up as the judge and wear police outfits under their gowns? But before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe so you're notified as soon as one of my videos comes out. The film starts with archival footage setting the stage for the events to follow. MLK and Bobby Kennedy have been assassinated, the US is at war in Vietnam, and political and social unrest have spread across the country. The importance of this context is highlighted by Sacha Baron Cohen's character ABBIE Hoffman later in the film when justifying fellow accused Tom Hayden.
You can do anything to anything by taking it out of context, Mr. Schultz.
This trial doesn't make much sense without framing it within the context of a United States at war, divided and on the brink of social change. That's why Sorkin begins the film with actual footage to properly prime the audience, and the parallels to modern day are obvious as protests rage across the streets, police engage in brutality, and the socio-political climate is at a tipping point. In fact, the first draft of this movie was written by Sorkin in 2007 after Steven Spielberg approached him about doing a movie on it, but with both men focused on other projects, it sat dormant for almost a decade until the 2016 presidential election. The resulting change spurred Sorkin to revisit the script and ultimately direct it himself. The first few minutes also set the stage of the protests themselves. The Democratic National Convention was in town and was a party divided. You may recall that the president at the time was Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson, having been sworn into power on November 22nd, 1963, 2 hours after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, seeing as he was the vice president. With a split Democratic Party and increasing animosity for the war in Vietnam, he shocked the nation by announcing he wouldn't run for re-election.
And I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
This pitted current Vice President Hubert Humphrey, the pro-war candidate, against Senator Eugene McCarthy, who was anti-war. So thousands of protesters descended upon Chicago to protest the DNC's nomination of a candidate who would be just as pro-war as the Republican nominee Richard Nixon.
There is simply not enough of a difference between Hubert Humphrey and Richard Nixon to make a difference. And so we're going to Chicago.
These protesters came from varying groups, like Bobby Seale, head of the Black Panthers, who protested against an unjust war sending thousands of African Americans to their death. Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis, who organized students who saw their colleagues shipped off to war, David Dellinger, a pacifist who ran the mobilization to end the war in Vietnam, Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, leader of the Youth International Party, also known as the Yippies, and finally Lee Weiner and John Freund, both professors charged for their involvement organizing the demonstrations. The trial would never have occurred if it weren't for the transition of power from Democrat to Republican, which saw former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, appointed by JFK, replaced by John Mitchell, appointed by President Nixon. Fun fact, John Mitchell was later found to be involved in the Watergate scandal. John calls in U.S. District Attorney Richard Schultz to invoke the Rapp-Brown Law, a law originally passed by Southern whites to limit the free speech of black activists. The law forbids conspiracy to cross state lines to incite violence. Schultz is caught off guard by this request since former AG Clark had the FBI investigate the riots and found out that it was actually the police who instigated the violence. But John Mitchell, under the direction of President Nixon, wanted to show the nation that there would be consequences for these protests and the Chicago 7 would be tried for their alleged crimes. Schultz, however, sees this as a bad decision, as it would only give them a bigger platform to spread their anti-war agenda.
On top of everything else, we're giving them exactly what they want, a stage and an audience.
For the state to successfully convict, they would have to prove these men, from varying groups and having different political motivations, conspired together to incite violence. And the prosecution was ruthless in its tactics, including Bobby Seale in the group, the head of the Black Panthers, and wanted for murder in Connecticut, a murder he would later be found innocent of.
And speaking frankly, the U.S. attorney wanted a Negro defendant to scare the jury. I was thrown in to make the group look scary.
Also, the scene where he was bound and gagged actually happened, and it didn't just happen for one day, it happened for several. You can see a courtroom drawing depicting this. And this resulted in defense lawyer William KUNSTLER calling the judge's courtroom, quote, a medieval evil torture chamber. Bobby was continually denied access to his lawyer, and later he'd be given a mistrial, leaving 7 to be tried and not 8. John Mitchell's decision to indict these members was also a personal one. His predecessor, Ramsey Clark, had apparently resigned an hour before Mitchell's confirmation, a sign of disrespect. So this was Mitchell's way of getting back at him, and why Ramsey Clark, played by Michael Keaton, was so eager to take the stand. The jury never got to hear his testimony, however, as the judge invoked voir dire, a separate hearing within the trial in which the judge can determine whether evidence is admissible. Not only that, he denied the defense's appeal to have the jury notified that the former Attorney General was questioned in the first place. As the film shows at the end, 78% of Chicago's attorneys had an unfavorable opinion of Judge Julius Hoffman, and they responded overwhelmingly negative when asked if he displayed an impartial attitude and courtesy to both the prosecution and defense. Because the trial was deemed a farce, Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin would often retaliate in kind, showing up one day in judges' gowns with police uniforms underneath. Not depicted in the film was how Abbie would continually call the judge Julie, and one day he even brought in a Viet Cong flag which had to be wrestled out of his hand. All in all, the defendants, including the lawyers, received 170 citations of contempt, ranging in prison time from 2.5 for Weiner and 4 years and 18 days to lead defense attorney William Kunstler. These citations would later be thrown out in the Court of Appeals, as were the prison sentences of the 5 ultimately convicted of inciting violence, with Weiner and Frone being acquitted. The film also speaks to the fractured nature of the Democratic Party, and one could argue how that party is still fractured today, with progressives and neoliberals constantly at odds. There's no better encapsulation of this than when Tom and Abbie are trapped against an upscale bar as the rich Democratic establishment watches the convention, oblivious to the men and women protesting outside. To further hammer home this point, Sorkin includes one party member saying,
"Am I the only one who sees what's going on out there?"
But even within this progressive movement, there are fractures. Tom talks about how Abbie and the Yippie movement do a disservice to their cause. They aren't going to win over hearts and minds by giving out flowers and levitating the Pentagon. They need to be taken seriously. And this seriousness and respect for authority to a government which looks at them with contempt is something his character has to overcome. We see him stand up when the judge leaves while the other accused do not. At the end, the judge tells him how courteous and respectful he's been during this whole process, and if his closing speech is brief and well-mannered, he'll take that into account when delivering his sentence. Tom needs to find the courage in himself to stand up to a court and country which has not shown him any respect. Courage like he asked Ramsey Clark to show in taking the stand.
Sir, you have to find some courage now.
He'll instead list off the names of the over 4,700 American soldiers killed in Vietnam since the trial began 5 months ago in protest of this sham, something even Richard SCHULTZ stands up for. However, the extent of his empathy for the defense is something dramatized by Sorkin. All in all, the trial of the Chicago 7 shines a light on some of the political issues we still face today. It's a scathing portrayal of the criminal justice system and the consolidation of power within political parties. The film asks us, how far are you willing to go to fight for what you believe in? Thanks for watching, everyone. Be sure to like and subscribe and share, as I'm always coming out with new videos. For more bad takes, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at ThinkStoryYT. Until next time, remember, Daddy loves you very much.